The publisher and chief editor of The Nation, Katrina vanden Huevel, drops by to talk about her new op-ed in the Washington Post and the decade that just passed of imperial overreach on the part of the United States. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. On the line with us is Katrina vanden Huevel, the editorial director and publisher of The Nation magazine, thenation.com, of course, the website. Her Twitter handle is Katrina Nation, or @TheNation. And she has a new op-ed out in the Washington Post titled "The 2010s Were a Decade of Imperial Overreach, and Trump is Making It Worse," which I thought was absolutely brilliant. Wanted to get her on to discuss. Katrina, welcome back to the program.
Tom, it's been a long time. Good to hear your voice.
Back at you. The 2010s. You know, we just finished this decade, and I realize, technically, I suppose the new decade starts, next year, but that's not how history looks at it, And so we're now in the 2020s. You define the 2010s as a decade of imperial overreach. What does that mean?
It means that in the focus on Trump and this idea that he was an isolationist, we lose sight of, first of all, that he's deployed troops to Saudi Arabia, he's deployed troops around the world, he's betrayed his promises about ending endless wars. That's today's news in many ways. But we also, need to understand that President Obama, of course, he did negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. He negotiated normalization with Cuba, which tragically is under siege, but he did send more drones out. He intensified the drone warfare. We did regime change in Libya, participated in regime change in Syria with the terrible destabilization of Europe we're witnessing with displacement of people and refugee crises. And the Cold War against Russia and against China intensified under Obama. And we now confront, Tom, it seems to me, sitting here today, the possibility of a three-front Cold War. In 2018, the national security strategy of this country identified Russia and China as our greatest adversaries, downgraded counterterrorism. But with this administration's policy of, quote, maximum pressure on Iran, we could be confronting a third front in these Cold Wars. And I think it's very dangerous for our security. Expansion is not prudent. It's not constructive. It doesn't expand our security. More and more Americans, I believe, are seeing the folly of endless war, and more polls show that Americans don't seek retrenchment. They're not isolationists. They want a different kind of engagement with the world and seek jobs, seek funds to rebuild this country for health care, for education. So I think it's an inflection point coming out of the 2010 to 2020. But what a turbulent last 9-10 days to begin to think anew about what America's role in the world could be.
Yeah, it really and truly is. I have been unable, in looking back over history, to find any examples of times when blockades or barricades or economic punishment, essentially, the sanctions, like Trump is trying to ramp up now on Iran. We've had sanctions against Russia going for a long time. We've had sanctions against Cuba that go all the way back to 1959. Yeah, Venezuela. I cannot recall, and I've been on this planet a long time, I can't recall a single time when any country, in response to any other country's sanctions. I mean, you had Eastern European countries that were under the thumb of the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union, who would still, react badly. I mean, to attempts at sanctions. Have sanctions ever worked? And if they haven't, why do we keep using them?
That requires a more knowledgeable historian, if I might, than you or me. But as we witness the sanctions-happy Congress, the sanctions-happy administration of Donald Trump, and to a certain extent Barack Obama, I believe that sanctions have just intensified, strengthened nationalism in many countries.
Right.
You certainly see that in Iran, where this maximum pressure, so clearly designed to use sanctions to affect regime change, is failing. And in Venezuela, it simply brought misery to a country. And you can argue that it took it takes different factors to bring the kind of humanitarian disaster to a country as we're witnessing in Venezuela. But U.S. sanctions have clearly played a role. And the other thing, Tom, is it often, almost always hurts ordinary people. It doesn't hurt the elites who know how to protect themselves. I think we need to think and really think hard about why we're in this sanctions trigger moment. Of course, better than outright military conflict, but sanctions, as people have said, you've heard this, Tom, it's another form of warfare. Mm-hmm. So I think it's time to think anew. I will say that regime change needs to be exposed for the disaster, the kind of, the militaristic disaster, immoral, the violations of international law that, this country has perpetrated against countries. It's a measure of how far we've lost a sense of bearings as a nation, that people cheer the assassination of however an odious figure. But we've been involved in the assassination business for years, Tom. You know that. I mean, mm-hmm. Your listeners should go back to the Church Committee of 1975, even before then. But it's now so brazen and blatant and open and discussed on nightly cable shows that I think we are at risk of losing our moral moorings. But even more than that, if you believe in a pragmatic, constructive foreign policy, national security policy that makes this country more secure, we're losing that.
Yeah, this stuff has been normalized. In your
could I say one thing, Tom? I mean,
please.
You're a media watcher, right? Well, first of all, as we sit here and talk today, I think it's very, very positive and healthy that there are about 350 protests going on around the country. No more war with Iran. Mm-hmm. Again, it shows people in motion, people waking up to understand they need to protest. I think it's very important that in the last months, Congress has reasserted its role in matters of war and peace. It was not hopeful at the end of last year with the National Defense Authorization Act that I believe only 41 Democrats voted against it. Mm. And within it, as you know, there was a provision which Representative Ro Khanna and Senator Bernie Sanders, have brought out again today, with legislation to not permit the funding of any military action against Iran.
Right.
Ilhan Omar, Barbara Lee are again working to revoke the 2001-2 authorization to use military force, which has been used cynically, wrongly, brazenly since 2001 as a cover for intervention in countries which had nothing to do with 9/11.
Right.
I think these are good signs of Congress reasserting its role. It will take more. And there is, of course, the danger that, you don't want just process. You want a substantive role by Congress.
Right. And we've seen the results of regime change now. In fact, you could argue that the current state of Iraq and Iran are both the result of regime change that we did back in the 1950s, overthrowing elected governments. This has just been U.S. policy for a long, long time. And it more often, I think, bites us on the butt than doesn't. You also write in your op-ed in the Washington Post that the encirclement of Russia with U.S. and NATO forces as part of a strategy to weaken Russia economically and politically might not be such a good idea. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's gone from encirclement, Tom, and deterrence to a more aggressive posture. It is highly dangerous that NATO, a vehicle, by the way, which should not have been expanded after the end of the Second Cold War, after the end of the Soviet Union, is sitting on Russia's border. The epicenter used to be Germany, now it's the Balkans or the Baltics. And I think that we don't need to be best friends with Russia, okay? But we need sober realism about a working relationship with Russia, which, by the way, country played an important role in negotiating the Iran nuclear deal.
Yep.
But we are confronting the breakdown of an arms control structure, Tom, beginning in 2002 when John Bolton, as an advisor to George W. Bush, pushed to repeal the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It was. We've seen now the end of the Intermediate Nuclear Range Force Agreement, the INF, and we're on the cusp of the end of START. It would be important to fight for an extension of START for 10 years. It's up in the next few months for renewal. But, Tom, as these nuclear pillars, nuclear security pillars, crumble, it is extraordinarily dangerous in ways I don't think people have focused on enough. To put it back together again is very tough. Russia's announced it has this hypersonic missile. Let's negotiate.
Yeah, well, Trump yesterday announced that we have one, that he said we're building them. Now, everybody knew that we were experimenting.
We don't want an arms race doesn't help security.
Yeah.
And it loots the money needed to rebuild countries, to provide people with jobs. And it is not about real security. We did an interesting piece a few days ago. Joe Cirinsoni of Plowshares Foundation, Guy Saperstein, commissioned several polls showing Americans are deeply concerned about America's nuclear policy stance, and they're also committed to more funding for jobs and healthcare and education, and less for a bloated defense budget, which is higher than it was during the Reagan years, during the Korean War, at other times in our history. You know that the central challenge, and we haven't even talked about the crisis in Australia, the existential crisis of climate, that's not going to be met by military force. That needs and demands other solutions and resolutions. So I think the nuclear piece alone should lead America back to understanding we need sober, realistic relationship with Russia and with China. The pivot to China under Obama was militaristic, and we need a different approach, Tom.